Now look, nothing comes from nothing, and in this life you need to work as hard as you can. Bryn Hewer was talking to his son. There is nothing in this world that you can get without sweat on your brow. As he stood by the top of the crumbling headland cliffs, he was waving his arms wildly to try and emphasise what he was saying. When I was a boy, I had to work for my father as he couldn't finish the stones for the great houses. It was true. Bryn had travelled far and wide throughout the kingdom as an apprentice to his stonemason father. He turned to face away from the wind that could still be felt from the sea so far away. He continued, and as my son, I would expect that you would help me to catch fish in the sea. I need someone to help me with the boat. Your mother is too small to handle the sails, and your sisters are too weak. I need you and your strong arms to help me. To pull the silver darlings on board. It was true that as a boy he had had to hold the marble and the soft sandstone stones steady as they were cut and skillfully fashioned by his father into beautiful flowers and vines, all for the houses of the rich and the great. He had been to places that commoners such as he could only see when they were craftsmen and journeymen. He had stories to tell and tales to unfold of all that he had done in his life, and the way that he was talking now would have made more sense if his son had been there beside him. In truth, his son was down with his mother and his two sisters by the side of the cliffs, a good long way away from the Abbey headland, pulling the black headless St. Hilda's snakes and devil's toenails out of the alum cliffs by the mouth of the Esk. They were not truly snakes, but stones that had the shape and form of snakes. Many said that these petrified animals were the ones that had been sent headless to their deaths at the hand of the good St. Hilda. The father stood in that place where Lady Hilda had stood, and saw his family from the distance of the cliff tops, and wondered how his life would have been if he had followed his father's trade. He was here in Priestby as a whim of his father. Together they had been to many places, and they had seen many cathedrals, castles, homes, estates, and beautiful churches in this country and in Normandy. One day, not 20 summers before, as they stood by the work they had done on the great cathedral in Lincoln, his father had said to him, "Before I die, I wish to see the splendours of Priestby before it falls into the sea. That Henry Tudor, our so-called King Henry, the 8th to bear his name, that Henry Tudor has no respect for the finery of those churches that do not follow him." The splendour of Priestby, so called because of the priests and nuns that lived in the great abbey, and sometimes known as Whitby or Whitby for the colour of their houses, was well known throughout the world. St. Hilda had sent the snakes into the sea so many centuries before with a curse and a crack of a whip. She had made the headlands safe for the building of a monastery when the Angles and the Saxons ruled this land by the North Sea. It was here that so many miracles had occurred, and perhaps, just perhaps, that was what his father had hoped for. Many said that at the 10th hour of the day, St. Hilda could be seen in the great abbey grounds, and those that were infirm or sick would be cured just by the sight of her, or by holding a relic of her great deed. The ridding of the snakes to make this a holy place, and pilgrims who still followed the Church of Rome by the dead of night would kneel and pray at the abbey. They would take a relic from Whitby, a headless snake that had been cast to its death by the miracle of St. Hilda. It was known that the walls had been fashioned from soft sandstone and looked as if they had been blown and smoothed by the wind. Bryn's father had wanted to see it, even though the great Henry Tudor had it wrecked and pillaged for the finery of the gold of the altarpieces. He had the stained glass windows smashed, and the priests, nuns and monks cast out to the four winds. He had done all of this for the love, no, for the lust of a woman, and to make sure that he had a son as an heir. All of the good that the monastery had done, the learning, the hospital, the greeting of pilgrims who only wished to worship what was good, now was all gone because of Henry Tudor. The two of them had wept as they looked at the ruins. They had travelled for so long and had wished to see the splendour of the abbey. They wanted to revel in the glory of its building, but instead they found ruin and wreckage. All of the work done by workmen like themselves was smashed and lay like pebbles upon the ground. They knew how long it would have taken to craft each stone, the toil it would have taken to have fashioned each and every window, the hours of back-breaking, lung-choking work to have made each dazzling piece of the windows. These were skills that could never be valued by the new church. Bryn's father had wished for a miracle to cure him and raise his spirits before he died, but his heart was broken by the sight of the damage done by the king in his God's name. As he buried his father in the grounds of what was left of the abbey, in the shadow of the great west front by the corner of the transept, he buried his stonemasonry tools with him. He vowed that he would never cut another stone for as long as he lived. That was why he could not go to the cliffs with his family to pull at the stones and release St. Hilda's snakes. Having travelled so far on land and sea, it was only fitting that he should learn the trade of a fisherman. It did not bring him happiness. It did not bring him wealth. He was poor. He knew sadness in his heart, as the sea was a terrible and unforgiving mistress. So he was no stranger to fear or being scared. Pilgrims would pay a good price for a St. Hilda snake, even on pain of death to carry such a thing, just to remind them of the old religion. The abbey was used to anger and ruin. If it wasn't the Danes, then it was the king's commissioners, tearing at the walls and the beauty of the building and all that it held. At least the old and noble bells lay in the belfry and sounded when the wind was high. The wind was high now, and the far distant sound of the sea was calling him to work, just as the seagull's screech filled the storm-tossed air. There was a satisfaction in knowing that the bells would not be moved from the abbey, as that would be an act of savagery, an act of desecration. There was a comfort in the fact that they could be heard throughout the whole of the town and far out to sea. It was a reminder of more peaceful times before good King Henry Tudor sat upon the throne. Bryn turned to go to the side of the sea with his bitter words still stinging and salty upon his tongue. He knew that he had to fish, and he knew he had to fish alone, with only a vague hope that one day, maybe by Michaelmas, his son would stand by his side on his boat and bring the silver cod and mackerel back from the sea, to sell the fish for those as wished to have as good a meal as any man could have. He noticed that one of the old monks, too old to go away from the shelter of the abbey, resting with his back against the wall of the transept, was looking at him with his kind grey eyes.
"My son, I wish you luck upon your journey upon the sea. I give you the good Lord's blessing as you go on your way. St. Hilda will look out for you."
Bryn was touched by the old man's peaceful words. He had seen and spoken to the old monk on many occasions in the previous years, but he had never been given such a full blessing. "Do not worry, old man. I have all the faith a sailor can need to sail upon the sea, and I will bring you the finest mackerel for you to feast on before the night has gone on this day." The old man reached inside of his worn cassock and pulled out a small silver coin from before Henry's time. But Bryn Hewer raised his hand in mock protest. "There is no need to pay me. You have faith enough for both of us, and I am sure that the good Lord will look out for us all on dry land and at sea." The fisherman liked the way that these few words from the old priest had settled the sadness and fear in his heart, and he could feel a shred of happiness as he quickly made his way to the harbour. As he made his way towards the sea and the roar of the waves, the sting of the salt filled the air. He could see that there was a great commotion going on by the harbour wall. One of King Henry's ships was there, moored and at anchor in the mouth of the river. No one could go out, and no one could come into the river's mouth. The ship's two great masts, with their sails resplendent with the shape of two Tudor roses, unfurled and flapped ominously and cast a shadow over men's hearts and souls. The magnificent ship lay like a predatory shark in the mouth of the river. These were the King's commissioners. But what in all of this earth could they be doing here? They had wrecked the abbey, they had taken everything that there was, and there was nothing left to take. It was then that the wind rose, and the bells, the ancient sacred bells of the abbey, chimed a sweet chorus above the height and howl of the wind. Bryn could hear the howls of the men and the women at the quayside when they heard the King's men shout,
Get out of our way!
Get away from this place! We have need of the bells in the abbey!
We are here on the King's business!
Make way! Make way! We will take the bells of Whitby in the King's name. The people, who would have wanted to surround them and bar their way, were no match for the King's guard, as they pushed them all to one side as if they were nothing more than children. Bryn felt helpless as he saw them all coming towards him. He had no love for the King, but he did not want to die upon one of his soldiers' swords, so he made way for the men as they marched up the hill and towards the cliffs at the Abbey headland. For the whole of the day the fishermen cursed and muttered about the soldiers and commissioners. They could hear them pulling and hauling at the remaining bricks and stones of the abbey. There were so many things that they were going to do to them, to teach the King's men a lesson, but they knew that for all of their plans, they would never be more than just talk. The soldiers had the bounty of the bells in their mind, and they knew nothing of the history and pride that the townsfolk felt for the sure and reassuring sound of their call. It was with a terrible grinding and groaning noise that the two majestic bells toppled to the ground and onto the grass of the abbey. If the townsfolk had been crestfallen before, now they were desolate, scared, angry and confused by the action of the soldiers as they callously rolled the bells to the quayside. Bryn, although he didn't come from this town, he knew these people and their lives that were wrapped up in the abbey and all that it stood for. He had to fight to mask a tear that crowded at the corner of his eye as he looked at each one of the townspeople's faces and into the immobile faces of the soldiers. For all that had happened to them, the bells still looked majestic as they stood by the jetty, huge, round and proud. And that was the problem for these robbing commissioners of the King. The bells were simply too big to fit into their keel boats, and they needed to get them from the jetty to the deck of the ship. There was a general air of happiness amongst the people of Whitby, as they thought that they would not lose their precious treasures again, and they would have to remain in the town for another century or more. It was the leader of the soldiers, the tallest and strongest of them all, who stepped forward and addressed the people standing around. I am sure that you do not want us to stay here longer than is necessary. There was a muted murmur from the crowd.
You're right, we don't want
Stay
you
inside
here.
the Whitby. Get away from this place. Take your thievery elsewhere. I am sure that you would like to see us gone. Someone from the back of the people called out.
To never see you again would be too soon. Go back to me.
The captain of the guard smiled to himself and chose to ignore this act of foolish bravery. I am sure that you would like to see us gone. Here he paused. And I could tell you that I would wish to never see you again in this. He turned and surveyed the scene before him with an arrogant look of distaste. In this fine town of Whitby. Now that you are freed of those hypocrites of monks and nuns. There was a roar of disbelief from the people at the quayside. Now that my liege Henry Tudor has rid you of the hypocrites and sorcerers who have been sponging off you forever in the name of the Lord, it is my great pleasure to relieve you of these troublesome bells." As all of this was being said, Bryn could see that his son had swum out to the harbour's mouth and was scaling the anchor rope of the king's ship. He could hardly believe his eyes, and he tried not to, but he couldn't help but stare at his son's actions. His son had something black and round in his hand, and seemed to be putting it into the hole that held the pulleys and ropes for the great iron anchor. The captain of the guards moved up to Bryn and said to him in a voice that would have charmed a dead man from his sleep, "You, sir." He was so close to Bryn that he could feel his breath in his face. "You, sir, as you can see, we are a little inconvenienced by our little gift for the king, and we need some help."
"Those bells belong with the Whitby. Those belong to St. Hilda. Well, you can go and find some help elsewhere. You can get away from our place."
The fisherman was looking over the soldier's shoulder in wonder as his son was scaling the other ropes at the aft of the ship and stuffing something black and round into the holes and pulleys. "As you can see, we are a little inconvenienced, and we need to have a ship, a local ship that knows these waters well. And we need a sailorman from these parts who can help us to get the ship and these trinkets." He pointed to the bells. "To get these to the king where they rightly belong." The captain of the guard was getting annoyed by the way that Bryn was not looking at him in the eye. "Damn you, man! You will give me respect!" He struck Bryn about the cheek with the back of his gauntleted hand. "What is it in God's name that you are looking at?" The guardsman was about to turn around, and he would have seen the fisherman's son falling into the water. So Bryn fell to his knees before him and begged as if he were a frightened dog. He knew that his son would be killed if he was found out. Your Majesty, your Worshipfulness, if you want, then you can use my boat. I will give it to you for the sake of our good King Henry." Those people who knew Bryn were startled to see him grovelling before this soldier's feet. Some just growled and barked in disbelief and disgust. The commissioner swaggered, but never turned to look towards the galleon in the harbour, or to see Bryn's son slip away into the safety of the river. "Now this is more like it. It is good to know that among you heathens in the north, it is good to know that there is at least one loyal subject for our king." Bryn crawled on his hands and knees, all the while looking to make sure his son was safe. "Yes, your royalness, there is no one in this town more humble a servant to the king than me." Someone in the crowd cursed out loud. "Bryn, you are nothing but a coward and a liar. You cannot let these thieves take our bells."
"That's right.
One of the other soldiers moved forward to find out who it was that had called out, but the captain raised his gloved hand to stop him. "Let these people have their say. This country has many a fine man who has crawled on his cowardly knees only to find himself in the company of a king." He smiled and whispered under his breath, "Oh yes, I know it only too well myself." He dusted his own knees and he bent to pick Bryn up and stand him beside him. "Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the only loyal subject to the House of Tudor from your village. He will help the king to take your bell in his boat. In fact, he will steer the boat to London, where he will be greeted in court by the King himself. Another voice broke from the crowd.
He may be welcome in the court, but he and his family will never be welcome in this town again.
Bryn had only grovelled because he wanted to save his son. He did not expect to have to go all of the way to London or to leave his family behind, to the anger of the crowd. A ring of soldiers surrounded Bryn as he made his ship ready to take the weight of the bells. With the crowd still cursing him and waving their fists at him, he wanted to explain what he had done and why he had done it. But that would have only caused the death of his own son. With the use of poles, pulleys, ropes and sheer brute force, the bells lay on the deck of Bryn's boat. With the bells tied to the deck, it lay heavy in the water, and he nervously slipped his moorings and set the sail to be rigged up behind the beautiful galleon. With the sea calm and the wind in their favour, the fisherman steered his fishing boat to run alongside the king's ship. But there was no waving goodbye from those who could see him. In ones and threes they turned their backs on him as he sailed away from the town he had known since his father had brought him here. As the day progressed, it had turned into a fine summer's evening as they sailed out to sea together like a father and a child, leaving the natural harbour behind them. When they had got a mile from the cliffs at a place called Black Nab, the king's men tried to raise the anchor for their sea voyage. They tried to pull the sails to make them safe, for now a slow wind was rising. They tried to pull again. They tried to cajole. They tried to tease and taunt the ropes to move out of their dangerous, locked positions. As is the way with the sea and the weather, all things can change. A calm breeze can become a furious rage. A fine mist can become a torrent. Anger turned to desperation as the wind started to buffet the ship and pulled it dangerously close to capsizing as the wind tore at the sails and the anchors. Anger turned to desperation as the wind started to buffet the ship and pulled it dangerously close to capsizing as the wind tore at the sails and the anchors would not go back into the ship. Bryn knew that the weather would not turn for the better, and he called upon the waters to make his end be quick. With the weight of the bells on board of his small ship, he could feel the water lapping over the gunwales, and he could see the silver darlings swimming about him as he slipped beneath the waves. As his eyes closed, he could see that his small boat was dragging the galleon down to the bottom of the sea, and he smiled when he thought that the bells would not be taken to the king. In the dark, salty wetness, he casually thought that he had never seen so many fish when he had been out fishing before. When he opened his eyes, at first he could not see properly. He thought that he was in heaven, as the windows of the abbey seemed to be filled with the coloured glass once more. The magnificent central aisle was lit up by candles, and there was the sweet and sickly smell of incense in the air. He could hear someone calling his name. It sounded like his father.
Bryn, Bryn, my son, Bryn, my son, you are all right now. You are here in the house of God once more.
He blinked, and this time he could see that he was lying on the grass that was on the floor of the abbey, and he was lying in the lap of his wife, as the old monk, who had offered him a silver coin that morning, was patting at his cheeks and hands.
My son, you are very lucky to have such a strong swimmer for a wife.
Bryn sat up. He didn't even know that his wife could swim, never mind save him from the sea. His wife's voice was like honey to his ears as she spoke. And you, Bryn Hewer, you are lucky. We are lucky to have such a clever son. Bryn was too weak to stand, but he turned to see his sea-soaked son. Oh yes, father, we had a lot of help from St. Hilda. This was too much for the fisherman to take. What do you mean? What do you mean we have had a lot of help from St. Hilda? We've had help from Lady Hilda? How could she have caused the galleon to sink? His head was swimming, and he was weak from his ordeal in the briny sea. Oh, that's easy, father. The son wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead as he reached behind his back and pulled out one of St. Hilda's snakes. When I climbed onto the king's ship, I pushed a little present from the good Lady Hilda into their pulleys to block their ropes. I'm sure that the pilgrims won't mind losing just one or two of the relics, just to save our bells from the king.
Mom? No. Sad. Scared. Sad. He may not have no food. He's poor. The fisherman. He's poor. He's sad. A big fish, a fat fish, skinny fish, shark. Fish. A big fish, a fat fish, skinny fish. The man sells a fish to the abbey. He's in a boat and then the shark comes up and... His wife rescued him and she took him inside the abbey. His wife rescued him and she took him inside the abbey.
Just as the day was turning into the night and the tide was about to turn, she picked the cockles, whelks, winkles and mussels from between the seaweed and kelp and always kept her eyes up and towards the darkening horizon. She knew that she had to always react quickly to the ways of the sea. She knew the ways of the fish and the fishermen. She knew that she didn't have much time before the great wealth of soft sand would be swallowed up by the sea. To get back to dry land, she would have to run on top of the bladder rack, Someone had once asked her if she could run on the water, because she would always wait until the last minute to get back to the safety of the shore. From a distance, it would look as if she could walk upon the spume and spray of the waves. On land, she was old and she was slow, but in the comfort of the sea, she had a swiftness that defied her age in years. The incoming tide was what was making her rush now, as she scratched at the rocks with her twisted arthritic fingers, her body bending over in the shadow of the great abbey on Whitby sands. The sea would allow no prisoners, as it rushed and gushed towards the land, on this the flattest part of the coast for many a mile. Even down the coast at Robin Hood's Bay, the water was as hungry for human souls as it was for the land. The sea would gouge and batter at the cliffs and cause the line of the shore to change and fade into the sea. She had lived hereabout for the best part of her 45 years, and she had seen so many houses washed away into the sea. The sea had taken so many fathers and friends, families and loved ones' homes over all of the seasons that she had lost count of them all. Her family had started out in a fine red brick fisherman's house that had been her father's and his father's before that. It had been on the edge of the seashore, and it was just the right size for them all 5 of them. It was just the right size for them before the terrible cruel storm of 1805 had come and washed it all away. With what they had salvaged from the shore after the storm, they took it all to the shelter of the abbey. They took stones from the ruins and used them as a foundation for their new home. Bricks were slowly carried in old brandy barrels by their 2 strapping sons up from the shore and across the ridge of the cliffs. It wasn't too long before they had the makings of their new home. All it needed was a roof, but money was short, and they had nothing else in all of this world than the keel of their old fishing boat. It was upturned and secured to the walls, and looked as if it had always been there. It was meant to have only been a temporary measure, but 6 years had passed since that time, and, for all it was smaller than their original house, it was a place where laughter was not a stranger. As she remembered happy times, she counted out loud, "Father, Mother, me." She laughed out to herself, "Little Millie, Jasper, and our Bryn." But Louise Watson wasn't just looking to make sure she was safe. Oh no, she was watching out for the shore patrol of the excise men and the customs officers. She was watching the water for the boat that held her 2 sons and a daughter, who were bringing in, not fish, but the tea for the clerk of the courts, the baccy for the priest, and the nutmeg for the squire in the big house up the coast at Saltburn. "Darn varmints!" Her voice was harsh above the crash of the incoming tide. "Excisemen be damned to darnation!" She spat into the water to try and get the taste of the words from her lips. "Darn varmints they is! Just 'cause that jumped up corporal, Napoleon, and the Frenchies is having a war, ain't no need to take away a decent living from the likes of us." For a moment she looked up, straightened her back and rubbed at her shoulders. It was a hard living getting the small, slimy, hard-shelled creatures out of the nooks and crannies of the sandstone rocks. It was harder, more tiring work, having to cart the heavy wicker basket filled with her full day's collection of shellfish up onto the land and up the hill to their small house on the brow of the cliffs by the headland. It was perhaps this that she hated the most, second only to the corrupt customs men. She hated the fact that the rough stone would cut at her hard-soled feet. Even a lifetime of standing barefoot in freezing cold salty water couldn't stop the stone scratching and scouring the skin from her feet. After all of this time, she still knew the pain of briny sea water leaking into a cut on her ankle or a graze at her shin. The only comfort that she did have was that she knew that amongst all of the things that her children were smuggling in, their boat would be heavy in the water with the gold that they were carrying. 100 gold bars, as big as a child's fist, should be enough to bribe that clerk. That should sweeten that varmint. to let my Jack go free. The water lapped at her feet, and she bent down to pull the last of the day's haul of mussels. Her husband, Jack Watson, had been accused of killing the captain of the excisemen. Captain Paul Peake was no friend to those who wanted to make a few honest shillings by smuggling in some contraband without the benefit of a tax from the king. The war with the French had brought a tax down on everyone and everything. That was why there were so many people trying to get some of the comforts of life without having to pay the taxes and levies that the government piled onto them. That was why the farmers were charging so much for food.
Don't you know there's a French war and the cows ain't got no grass?
That was why the butchers were giving short measure when you wanted to have meat on the table.
Why, the cows ain't got no grass, and there ain't so many of the beasts. All of the meat is going to our brave lads in Flanders.
That was why the landlords were putting more froth into the pot than there was beer.
Napoleon needs to be fought by a thirsty army. All of the beer needs to go to fight the Frenchies.
As far as Louise could see, honesty had gone out of fashion, and everyone was blaming the war for his or her own greediness. This was what made the excise and customs men so unpopular. They were trying to make sure that no one got anything without them having to pay twice what they had paid before the war. Among the excise men, there was no one more unpopular than honest Captain Paul Peake. It was no coincidence that his name was the same as the assizes judge at York. It was no surprise that his brother was the head jailer at the castle at Lincoln. And he was no more a captain than I am a Dutchman. Influence and corruption caused many a man to rise above his worth and skill. The Peakes family had bought and sold titles and power for centuries, and honest Captain Paul was just one in a long line of rogues who traded as judges, priests, landowners and excisemen. Wherever there was a chance to scoop some money from the people, then you could guarantee that there would be a finger, hand or a fist of the family Peake in the pie. Louise was no stranger to cheating herself. Letting her children become smugglers is not exactly the fairest of things. But needs must, as she would say. It is either that or starve. And if we don't do it, then someone else will. And that someone else will probably be called by the name of Peake. Perhaps it was the fact that she had said this often and loudly in and around the inns and taverns of Whitby that got her and her husband Jack noticed. Perhaps it was the fact that she was easily recognised by anyone who saw her that got them the reputation of having no love for Captain Paul Peake. She always wore the same patched dress, come wind, come rain, come shine. Her arms were bent and her fingers were crooked and stiff from picking at the shellfish at the shore. If you were to ask me, then I would say that apart from being the only woman in the town to wear heavy, thick woolen trousers beneath her dress, the fact that she had cheated and stolen from everyone, including her own family, it was said on one occasion that she had lied when playing snakes and ladders and laid a wager, a bet that she won. A bet that she won with her own grandchildren. It was the fact that no one had been spared her lying, cheating ways that made her be noticed. When the crew of the customs men returned from one of their patrols over by Robin Hood's Bay without the company of their captain, before they even had the chance to say what had happened, Jack Watson was taken in irons to the jail and accused by Judge Peake of the murder of his nephew Paul. No one noticed that the crew of the boat seemed relieved that they didn't have to explain why the captain was missing. They were never accused. The judgment was made by all of the lying, baying relatives of the captain, as all they needed was an excuse to get rid of the thorn in their side, Jack Watson. It really meant that the family Peake could then get on with their own smuggling and not have to worry about any competition. What they hadn't counted on was the dogged determination of Louise and her children. They knew that Jack wouldn't have done such a thing. They all knew him too well for that. It was true that there was no love lost between the captain and the father of their children, but he would never resort to murder on the high seas, as you know. Murder upon the high seas carried the penalty of death or transportation to the colonies. At least it would, if the prisoner was there to be hanged or to be taken on the journey halfway across the world. Louise knew that she had no choice but to see if she could turn the ear of one of her husband's jailers. The fact that the jailer bore the name of Peake meant that there was every chance that he could be helped in forgetting to lock the jail door to Jack's cell for the right amount of gold. As it happened, the right amount of gold would be 100 bars, brought in from the lowlands of Holland by the dead of night and without the cost of a tax from the king or his customs men. All of the worry and doubt about her husband and the risk her children were taking in sailing across the North Sea in a heavy-laden boat had put a pale, tired, wrinkled look on Louise's face. She had never looked well, but the care and concern had given her a weary, ill look, where once her skin had been fine and smooth. For all that the weather had been terrible higher up the coast, Scarborough, just 20 or so miles away from Whitby, had known one of the calmest September evenings that it had enjoyed in many a year. The old man rested his bones in a well-used chair by the blazing fire of the ancient inn and wondered about his life upon the sea. He pulled his fine fingers through his long greying hair and knew that he was weary of always having to go out amongst the fishing boats. He was tired of riding the sea waves, for if he was to be asked, he would say that he had no stomach for the sea. This was a rest from the pressure of having to breathe in the salty sea air. His belly was full. He had more love than he had ever had in the whole of his life, and his glass was never emptied. Excise men or no excise men. Here in the comfort of the inn, with a fine widow woman that he had met on the shore one night, not 2 weeks ago, who incidentally owned this prosperous inn, he wanted for nothing, and knew that if he had any say in what was left of his life, he would never stray away from this place. The cold sea water was starting to get to the lower part of her shin, and she sighed to think that 100 bars of gold could buy a fine house away from Whitby. 100 bars would mean that they would never have to work again. 100 bars of gold would change their lives for the better and forever. Louise was walking out of her daydreaming when she saw a boat. Her heart leapt in her chest to think that it was the safe return of her children from their perilous voyage, but then she realised that she knew that the boat was there because there was a lantern on board. She had taught her children well. No lights by the side of the shore. Those customs men will be able to see the slightest flicker of a flame. Always keep your eyes used to the dark, and you will be able to see the light from our house by the abbey, and that'll light your passage through to the old Cove Harbour. The old harbour by the banks of the headland, to the east of the Esk. She now knew that the boat that she could see was that of the excise men. If they were here, then they might catch her children as well. The Peakes would have her husband, her children, and the gold. The tide was now at her knees, and she knew that she would have to get away from the clutches of the waves, but she had to try and distract the customs men if she wanted to save her family. Instead of trying to get to the shore, she flung herself into the sea and started to scream and yell as she thrashed about in the waves. Don't leave an old woman to drown in the waves. You know it's bad luck. Her plan seemed to be working, for the customs men called out, "Who's there? Who's that in the water? What do you want? What are you doing out here in the sea?" It would be a lie to say that this was the first time that Louise Watson had tried this trick, but it always seemed to work. As she slipped on the stones and kelp, she could hear them say, "It is a woman. It's an old woman by the looks of it. We had better save her." She smiled in the water and screamed again, "Help me, help me, help me! I'm an old woman stuck in the sea." She smiled in the water and screamed again, "I'm an old woman stuck in the sea." As she had enticed them away from their patrolling duties, she could see that her children were pulling at their own oars with all of their will and might to get away from the customs boat. Even as she was caught unaware by the tide, and the thick wool of her trousers was dragging her deeper than she wanted to, she could see her Jasper and Millie leading the heavy boat filled with the Dutchy gold. She was pleased that they were all heading for safety and the old cove. The plan in her head was to step up out of the water and run away from the king's excisemen and lead them a merry dance to the shore. But she was caught in the riptide that ran the length of the seafront at Whitby. She was being pulled along by the water, and even though she was a strong swimmer, the pull of the tide was too strong for her to resist. Now she was screaming, but it wasn't a show. She no longer had to pretend. She was drowning. "Help me, help me, help me! I'm really going underwater! Help me! Help me!" "Just who is that?" One of the customs men raised his lantern to the water. He had a voice that Louise recognised. "Who is that? Who's that? Who's that? Who's that? Who's that?" As the water dragged at her clothes and her body, she had to think of where she had heard the voice before. The water was like cold daggers at her skin, and her breath was hard to take and to hold in her body as she swirled and flailed in the water like a piece of sodden driftwood. Then it came to her. It was Judge Peake. He had been tempted to come on board by his brother Nathaniel Peake. He was here to gloat over the capture of those nefarious Watson children. He was here to take his share of the gold for himself and in person. As he got closer to her body in the boiling, rippling water, he cursed out loud, "Not you! Not you!" He pointed his well-manicured finger at her for her to plainly see. "Not that damned Watson woman! Watson woman! Watson! Not only has she caused me to lose our quarry of her children, and the gold, and the baccy, and the nutpeg. Now she's pretending that she is drowning. She could see him turn in the boat and bark an order at the men. "Haul away, lads! There's nothing here to see and there's nothing here to save. The sea can have her and be welcome to her. Be welcome to her. Welcome to her. Welcome to her." Louise raised her hands in the air, almost in prayer and a gesture of regret. And as she did so, she slipped beneath the waves with the words, "Sorry for all that I've done in my life. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry." The words were teeming from a quivering voice, with only her crooked, skinny fingers pointing to the sky. Her body lay on the deck of the customs boat like a heavy landed fish. There is one thing that a true sailor fears, and that is to have to leave a body in the water, whether it be a man or a woman or a smuggler's wife called Louise Watson. Not all of the men on board of the bark could find it in their hearts to leave Louise for the sea and for fish bait. They well remembered a glass of grog or a fine cigar that had come from her family's trips across the water. Against the orders of the judge, they had hauled her in, and they were talking amongst themselves as they looked at her still, wet body. The judge was pacing the length of the amidships. "You men should learn a bit of respect for your betters. When I told you to leave her, then you should have left her where she was." The men were used to their skipper, honest Captain Paul Peake. They were used to his screaming of orders, and for this one time they were defiant and resolute in their dislike for the good judge.
Perhaps it'd be better if you were to learn some respect for those as to hear you.
They were crowding about the judge, and he did not like it one small bit.
Those as has to do your bidding, even if we don't agree with what you want us to do.
A fist was raised to his face, and he was feeling vulnerable and weak and very far away from his position of power in the courtroom. One of the men, Jim Carr by name, stepped up to him and spoke into his frightened ear for all to hear.
Aye, perhaps it would be better for all of those people to hear as how you asked us. No, as I clearly remembers it, you told us to put your nephew Paul Peake into a boat.
There was triumph in his tone and dismay in the face and body of the powerless judge.
I remembers it.
He looked for approval and got it from all of the men.
Oh, you're right, you did say
you're
that.
You're not
told
wrong.
me too.
You're right, you did do that.
I remembers it well, that you wanted us to put your nephew into a leaky boat and set him adrift in the cold North Sea to die, set him away, so that no man nor beast would ever see his bones or flesh again.
There was an ominous rustling of murderous agreement from the rest of the men.
We've seen it now, It seemed that he was getting too close to knowing as how you was behind all of the smugglering that were going on in the high part of Whitby, and it was as you suggested to me that it would be worth our while to get rid of him and his bullying ways.
More deep-throated roars of approval came from the rest of the men.
Oh,
we've heard it there.
Now we've heard it from you, Jim Carr. We know it's right.
Another man stepped forward.
And as I remembers it, you said that it would be better for us all if we was to do as we was told. Too strict was the way as how you described your own nephew, your own flesh and blood. Too strict. And one of you could well become the captain of the customs boat if you were to throw him overboard. You said as how it would be worth our while. It would be worth our while to kill.
The talking stopped as the body of Louise sat up and spoke.
And I think that would be worth your while too.
The superstitious sailormen all screamed and pushed each other to one side to be the first to leap from the side of the boat and risk a watery death rather than face the ghost and wrath of Louise Watson.
It's a ghost! Oh, we're down to go to the bottom of the sea for what we done.
She was exhausted, but smiling as she raised herself from the deck and shakily made her way towards the judge, who was cowering on his knees, praying and pulling at his rosary before the spectre of Louise Watson. In the distance, the bells of Black Nab could be heard, which only served to make the judge pray faster. She smiled and curtsied, and for a brief moment in the misty moonlight, she looked like a girl of 10 again.
There's no God that you can pray to that will help you now.
She was loving every moment of her victory.
I think that you should have a small share of that duchy gold that my children have brought in.
The judge was puzzled and stopped his praying for a moment. Any thought of money drove his fear away.
If I give you gold, then you will use it to bribe whatever stinking relatives you have left to get my Jack from out of the prison.
She was almost waltzing about this kneeling form in front of her.
I thinks as how you should go to your courts and make sure that everyone knows as how it was his men, those stinking varmints who took to the water, and with God's good grace they will never be seen about the streets of Whitby for as long as you draw breath. You will tell everyone as how it was all a big mistake, and my Jack, my children, and
here she bent down to meet his quaking, quivering eyes,
and me, Louise Watson, was always the underdog and was wrongly accused, and as how you have seen the error of your ways.
She was loving this. "As how you have seen the error of your ways, and how we as the most respectable of families in the whole of East Yorkshire." The judge brought himself to his feet again. He knew that she knew everything about him, and that he had no chance of bringing the boat back to dry land without her help. "It's yours, and I will do as you ask. I am." "Yes?" She was very interested in what he was going to say. "I am a reasonable man, and I will be as good to you as you will be good to me. All I ask is you keep your mouth shut about my little arrangement with those rats who have left this stinking ship. There, you have my word upon it." He offered his hand, but she refused to take his handshake. "We will see what happens in the months that follow as to whether you will know my hand in friendship." She took the tiller and steered the boat to the harbour, where many people were shocked and surprised to see Louise Watson and Judge Peake on board of a boat together. But they knew that it was better to keep their curiosity to themselves. No sooner had Judge Peake stepped upon the shore than he fell to his knees and kissed the sandy jetty. His glee was very short-lived, as Louise whispered in his ear that there was work to do and money to change hands, in case you've forgotten. Curiosity was barely sufficient to express the way that the townsfolk gasped when the news of Jack Watson being freed and returned from his jail sentence, never mind being spared from the hangman's noose. Things in Whitby returned to the way that they had always been, except Louise had fine clothes upon her back. She had a fine big home for her family, and they always ate at tea with the good judge and his wife upon the third Thursday of the month, or whether the judge wanted to, or not. In Scarborough, the old sea captain grew fat and loved to be seen in the corner of the snug of the inn, and he would tell his tales about how he had travelled on the sea. No one called him by his true name. He had always just been known as the captain. He enjoyed his life, and he enjoyed his wife, the landlady. He would often tell the story of how he met his Nancy. People would beg him to tell his terrific tale of how he had been set adrift in a boat by his unhappy crew. They would buy him the best smuggled brandy and plead for him to tell about how he had battled the sea and a gale and had landed upon the edge of the sea on the wide Scarborough sands. They would fill his pipe with baccy from the Indies, and no one asked where or how it had gotten there, and they would listen in awe and wonder at what he had to say. The years of telling the story made it bigger and better and longer and stronger, as all the best stories do. He found that he could have friends and people who liked him for who he was and what he could do, not for what his family would threaten them with. It was only when he died, when they went through the few pieces of paper from his troubled past, that they found out his real name. They had his body buried in his native Whitby, with a generous and loving headstone. It could be seen in the grounds of the far part of the abbey for many decades afterwards. The words wore away with age, but at one time, long after the war with the Frenchies had ended, you could read, "Here lies the body of a good and strong sea captain friend. No one knew his name until the end. Rest in peace. Honest Captain Paul Peake. Captain Paul Peake.